Hey folks, and welcome to a special Passion for Sound rewind review. If you haven't seen one of these before, this is the first one I've ever done, and it's called a rewind because I'm revisiting a product that I've already reviewed once before. You might ask why I'd bother doing that, and the answer is that since I reviewed the Sparkos Labs Aries headphone amplifier and preamp about 2 years ago now, since then, I've upgraded a great deal of my equipment. I've got a better DAC, I've got better headphones than I had then, and I've also heard a whole lot more gear in the meantime. And so I thought it was a good idea to come back and revisit the Aries. There's a few more reasons why I want to revisit it as well, but I'll get to those in the review. Before I get into the content of the review though, I just wanted to say if you want to see any other rewind reviews, other revisits of products that I might have looked at in the past, then check out the link down below to my recommended products and have a look to see which products I recommend and therefore which ones I probably still own, and let me know if any of those you'd like to see in a rewind review. For now though, let's jump in and find out why I think the Sparkos Labs Aries deserved a second round of review here on the channel. One more thing I should mention before I get into the review is that I've started to change how I post on Instagram these days. And specifically the reason I mention that is if you want to see a sneak peek of what's coming in the next week or two, then make sure you follow me over on Instagram. It's Passion for Sound AU, and watch the feed there for the Glamour videos for my upcoming reviews. It's a great way to see what's coming, to see what you might want to hold out and make a reminder of for yourself, and also hopefully you'll just enjoy the videos. So make sure you follow me over on Instagram and keep an eye on the feed. For now though, let's get into the rewind review of the Sparkos Labs Aries. Back when I first reviewed the Aries, I had it on loan from Sparkos Labs themselves. Andrew there was very kind enough to send me one to check out. And I do want to say another huge thanks to Andrew from Sparkos Labs for trusting my channel, as small as it was at the time, with a review of his amazing headphone amp. This is a top shelf, top tier level headphone amp, and I was just a tiny channel at the time. I'm still not a particularly large channel here, but definitely there's a lot more subscribers now than there were 2 years ago. So thank you, Andrew, for having that faith in me. Having had the amp on loan, I was a little bit sad to see it go, but I wasn't aware of how sad I was until I had the chance to bring one back into my life. And for that, I want to say a huge thanks to Anu, who is the local Australian distributor for Sparkos Labs these days. Anu was able to help me out with a small discount so I could buy the Sparkos Labs Aries again, partly for ongoing use in the channel, as I'll talk about soon, but also to allow me to do this rewind review and see just how good the Aries is now that I've got a top shelf DAC and headphones to go along with it. Not that I had bad gear last time I reviewed it, but it's a whole nother level now. I know that's a lot of introduction and not a lot of review, but I just wanted to put this into context that having had this, having let it go because it was on loan, and then having the chance to buy it back, it was good enough that I absolutely wanted to buy it again. And that's going to give you a sense of where this review's headed, but it doesn't yet tell the whole story. To put into context why I'm describing this as a top tier headphone amp, part of the picture there is the price of it. The standard base model Sparkos Labs Aries, and it comes in 2 levels. The base model retails for $2,500 US. The model that I've got here on my desk is the fully featured version, and that comes in at $2,995 US. So we're talking $3,000 US of headphone amplifier here. It's a significant investment in audio, and therefore it needs to be good enough to justify the price tag. Before we get into the features and functions, I'll just clarify the difference between the base model and the full model. The base model of the Aries has 2 RCA inputs, 2 pairs, and also a front 3.5mm input. It doesn't have any audio outputs, so it's just a pure headphone amp. When you go to the full featured version, you get XLR inputs on the back, so you're getting still the 2 RCAs plus an extra pair of XLR balanced inputs, and you're also getting a pair of XLR outputs and a pair of RCA outputs for preamp functionality. So you're getting a fair bit of bang for buck. That $500 is getting you the ability to connect this to a balanced DAC, but also more importantly, give you the ability to run it as a preamp. And that's one of the things I really love about the Aries, as we'll get to soon, is it makes for a stellar system hub. And what I mean by that is being able to have a DAC connected to this, or even a few DACs connected to this, and then feed it out to other devices. Obviously you can run headphones directly from here, but then I've also had it running to different amplifiers, both in terms of things like tube amplifiers, but even other solid state amplifiers, and having this be my volume control for everything. So I love that about the Aries, and I will elaborate on that shortly. But that's the key difference between the base model and the full. If you don't need balanced input or you don't need preamp capabilities, there is no performance difference between the two. So everything I'm going to say about performance and general features is exactly the same. If you don't need those extra features, don't spend the extra $500. But let's now talk about some of the features and functions, just in case you haven't watched my original Aries review. The Aries is a fairly simple industrial design. It's not a particularly attractive looking amp. It's got this front faceplate, which has got quite sharp edges, and then a very simple folded metal housing that sits behind it. So there's nothing flash going on. There's nothing super stylish going on, and that's fine by me, but it is something to be aware of. That said, I do think it's a nice looking amp, particularly in terms of the front panel. Touring the front panel quickly, we've got these two control knobs, which are switchable. So you can have either one as balance and the other one as volume, meaning that depending on where you sit and where you're more likely to reach for the control knob, you can make that the one you use most often, which is probably going to be volume. So in this case, I've got the volume control on this side because I have it sitting here on my desk, so it's easy to reach to with my right hand when I want to control the volume. And I've got this other side as the balance control, and you can see the sliders there, changing the balance as I turn the wheel. So it's great that this is an amplifier that gives you very easy control, and it also gives balance control for those that need it. And not all headphone amps do that, so it can be a very, very key feature for people that might have unilateral hearing loss. Another thing worth mentioning, which you might have heard with those little clicking sounds, is that the Aries implements a very, very precise stepped volume control. So that volume control is used both for the main volume, but also the balance control as I understand it. And there's a whole bunch of relays and resistors changing the output volume as you turn the dial. What that means in terms of normal usability is that the Aries has incredibly precise volume control all the way down to the lowest levels. And it also offers a huge range of steps. So we can ramp it all the way down to -53 dB and all the way up if you need to. And the key is that every single step is very precise and very small. So if you're controlling anything from IEMs through to a pair of hi-fi and Sparkos, this is going to give you the volume control that you need. While we're talking volume control, I should also mention the gain controls. So the Sparkos Labs Aries has 3 gain levels. You've got low, medium and high, and that's +10 dB, +20 dB and +30 dB. Now if you've watched many of my reviews, you might know that I don't like amps that offer anything higher than 0 dB for their lowest gain setting. And the reason for that is there's often too much volume and not enough volume control. Well, the good news is with the Aries, there is no such issue. Because of the spectacular volume control in the Aries, it is absolutely perfect whether you're using +10, +20 or +30 gain. And that's something I absolutely adore about the Aries. It gives you independent gain control for each of the 3 inputs. So you could have +20 on your RCAs and +10 on your XLRs. You could have +10 on one RCA, +20 on another. Whatever you want to do, you can set it up to suit you. And then you never have to worry if you're using headphones or IEMs to listen to those sources, because that volume range is so vast and so small stepped that you can absolutely enjoy any type of headphone you like. And the same is true for preamplification. It gives you all the same abilities with the preamp that I've just described for the headphone stage. And that's one of the things I absolutely adore about the Aries. And it's one of the reasons it's my go-to as my sort of central hub amplifier in my overall system. And I'll talk about that soon in the context as well of the Burson Soloist GT, because that's another stellar headphone amp with some very similar features. And yet there's reasons that I absolutely adore the Aries and don't quite warm as much to the Burson Soloist GT. It's not about the sound in this case, it's about the features and the usability, which I'll come back around to shortly. A couple of final things to mention while we're talking about features is that there's quite a sensitive clipping protection circuit built into the Aries, which can occasionally get tripped up, but for the most part it's an excellent feature for making sure that you're not clipping the inputs. So if you've got an extremely hot output from a DAC, and what I mean by that is a very high voltage, something like say the 5.3 volts coming out of a hollow spring or a hollow May, it can cause clipping, particularly if you've got it set to plus 20 or plus 30 dB gain. It can push things too far. And the nice thing is the Aries will let you know. And that's great because it does two things for you. It prevents you from having distorted and less than perfect sound, but it can also potentially prevent you from damaging your equipment. Clipping can actually cause damage to transducers over time because it actually produces extra heat in the voice coils and could damage them. It's unlikely in the world of headphones to have that happen, but it is possible, and so I like the fact that the Aries protects you from that. It's also protecting you from failures in a DAC, shooting a whole lot of DC audio through your system, and so to me it's really just a case of the Aries giving me the sense of a really bulletproof setup. A setup that's protected against anything and it's going to handle anything thrown at it. The final feature I'm going to mention, and you've already seen it in action, is this nice LCD display. It uses a touchscreen display just for simple button presses, and I love that because it keeps the front panel simple, but it lets you easily control things. One of my complaints when I recently reviewed the Burson Soloist GT was that the control system using the volume control as a selector button and then also a rotation led to some occasional problems where as you press the button it would also change to a different selection. You have no such problems here. You can very easily go into the menu system like so, choose the exact thing you want to change. Let's say here I want to mute one of the outputs, and now I can see my options on screen and make the changes I want. And this is probably a good screen for me to show you because it makes it clear just how simple it is to interact with the Aries. So this screen we're looking at now allows me to choose if I want to mute either the headphone output or the preamp output. And that means that you've got control at any point in time to have your preamp on or off and or your headphones on or off. So you can permanently leave headphones plugged in and still have control over your preamp output. If you want to have both running at once for some reason, that's completely fine too. So I do love the interface on the Aries. It's an absolute winner. A little bonus is that you can control the colors on the Aries display. So you can change what I've got here as the white background. It can be any color you like using a combination of red, green and blue. And that does include having a black background. And then you can also change the text on here. It's not a major feature. If they hadn't included it, I wouldn't have minded, but it's kind of fun to have that control. And ultimately this display, and I don't mean the color changeability so much as the interface, the ability to easily see and select the functions you want, this display and interface approach is one of the very biggest reasons that I adore the Sparkos Labs Aries. Sometimes the choice between one amplifier and the other will come down to more than sound. If you have two amps that have an equally enjoyable and performance level of sound, then it's often going to come down to which one you enjoy interacting with more. The Aries makes listening always a pleasure. Something like the Soloist GT performs incredibly well, and I will compare them sonically in a moment, but it's not quite the joy to interact with that the Aries is. And that's where the Aries for me is one of my favourite ever audio products to interact with. And one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to do this rewind review was to really hammer home just how important that is when you get to the level where a few different amps are all comparing about the same sonically. And so having raved now enough, I think, about the interface, let me give you a really quick tour of the amp, and then we'll talk about the power output and the sound quality, putting it up against the Burson Soloist GT. Looking at the back of the Aries now, you can see that we've got a power socket here. So this takes a mains input power. There's no wall wart or anything, and Andrew from Sparkos Labs has designed some excellent power management on the inside using a lot of his own proprietary products. And the end result, as we'll talk about soon, is a very pristine sound. Moving on from there though, we've got a pair of outputs here. So we've got XLR outputs first, and then we've got RCA outputs here, and there for the preamp output capability. So both of these outputs are always active at the same time. That's one thing, is you can't separate RCA and XLR pre-outs. But you can mute these if you want to, should you be using, say, headphones plugged in all the time, and then also wanting to have active speakers. Moving on from there, we've got, because this is the full version, as you can tell from the preamp outputs, we've also therefore got XLR inputs for balanced input, and then you've got two pairs of RCA inputs as well. So you've got a total of 4 analog inputs, including the 3.5mm on the front, and then you've got a total of 3 different outputs between headphones and 2 different preamp outputs. So as I said before, this is a really versatile hub-style device should you need that in your system. It's also, though, a pretty simple device as you can see here. It's just inputs, outputs, only the controls that you really need. There's no EQ, there's no crossfeed, it's just gain levels, volume levels, and balance control. And so let's now talk about power output and the quality of that power. Some people might be instantly put off by the fact that the Sparkos Labs Aries doesn't include an XLR output for your headphones. But I've talked about before the fact that balanced and single-ended outputs aren't necessarily better or worse. When it comes to driving headphones, a really high-quality single-ended circuit is going to perform just as well as a high-quality balanced circuit. Admittedly, sometimes when you get a headphone amp that has both, the XLR output will outperform the single-ended output, but that's often because of the circuit design, not because balanced output is inherently better. So don't look down on the Aries for not having an XLR output. As you'll hear me talk about in a moment, its performance is just as good as top-tier XLR output amps. One of the other things that sometimes balance provides, though, is additional power. And admittedly, the Aries is not the most powerful headphone amplifier on the planet, but it's got more than enough power to drive any headphone that I can think of. To put that into context, the specs of the Aries say that it's got an output capability of 355 milliamps and 14 volts. That translates into about 2.8 watts into 32 ohms, and that is absolutely buckets more than you're ever going to need for any headphone I can think of. To put that further into context, something like the Hi-Fi Sesvara to reach 110 decibels, which is more than you should ever listen at, it's dangerous, it's going to cause you damage to your hearing, but to reach those levels, the Sesvara needs a power output, if we break it down into milliamps and voltage, it needs 5.5 volts, which is just 40% of the maximum voltage available from the Aries, and it needs 91.5 milliamps, which is just 26% of what the Aries is capable of. So as you can see from those figures, we're not even getting to 50% of the capacity of the Aries, and we're driving the Sesvara to dangerous volume levels. At normal safe listening levels, you're not even getting close to what the Aries is capable of in terms of its maximum output. So this amp is going to drive any headphone you can think of, and any IEM you can think of, which is where it's fantastic, without batting an eyelid. And that's one of the major reasons that I love this amplifier. But before you think this is just an entire love fest on the Aries, it's not the best amplifier on the planet. I'm not suggesting that it is, but I wanted to talk through now, through the sound quality discussion, what it is about the Aries that I love, and why there are some compromises that I'm willing to make because of its amazing interface, its versatility, all details like that. I want to put it all into context. In isolation, if you're not comparing it to anything else, the Aries sounds incredibly smooth and transparent. It's very much like an invisible part of the source chain. The quality of the sound, without going into details just yet about treble, bass, soundstage, etc., but the general quality of the sound from the Aries is just this liquid sense of ease that pours out of it. It's incredibly enjoyable in that regard. But I think what's far more helpful when we're talking about an amplifier at this level is to actually put it up against another amp that I've recently discussed and also raved about, and really put it into context. In my review of the Burson Soloist GT, I ended up deciding that I thought the Soloist GT was the superior amp to the Sparkos Labs Aries. And sonically speaking, I do believe it has just a slight edge, but not in all ways. And that was another part of why I wanted to revisit the Aries here, was to put into context what both of them do really well. And something else that came out as I started playing around with these was that I tried some different interconnects. I've recently received a pair of XLR cables from Curious Cables, and in connecting those up instead of my usual AudioQuest Yukons, I heard quite a different presentation from these two amps. And what it really drew to my attention is that sometimes it's also about system synergy. It's not that suddenly my opinions on these amps drastically changed. It's that the different characteristics of those interconnects just ever so slightly lent me more towards one over the other without drastically changing anything. And specifically what I'm getting at here is that the Curious cables have a slightly more open and articulate sound, and those particular XLRs to me suited the Aries slightly better than the Soloist GT. Now obviously that may lead you to start wondering if I should talk about which XLR pairings or which other interconnect pairings every different DAC and amp combo should use, but as you can imagine, that just opens up way too many variables. So what I'm going to say to you is that the way to think about interconnects in the context that I'm talking about today is that if you've got an amp like the Aries, which is a little bit smoother, a little bit more intimate, as I'll talk about in a moment, then what you should be doing is looking for an XLR cable or an RCA cable that's a little bit more open and maybe a tiny bit more detail or treble focused. Whereas if you have an amplifier that's a bit more detail oriented and you don't want it super detail oriented, that's when you'd look for an interconnect that's maybe just a little bit more warmer and perhaps a tiny bit richer. So it's not to say that you need to get too stressed about interconnects. I just wanted to raise it here because it will subtly influence when there's comparisons like I do on this channel, which exact product is preferred over the other. Obviously there are times that I'll clearly say product X is definitely better than product Y, and in those cases, there's enough difference that the interconnects aren't going to be the reason. But when it's products like the Aries and the Soloist GT, where they're absolutely neck and neck, and it kind of comes down to preference, that's where interconnects can be the tipping point to choose which one is actually preferable depending on the system synergy. So I just wanted to cover that off so it didn't sound like I was contradicting what I'd said in the Soloist GT review, because the GT is still sonically the slightly better amplifier, I believe, at a technical level. But at a purely subjective and enjoyment-based level, it's like splitting hairs to choose between the two of them. And so let me go into some details to explain what I mean. One of the tracks I used when listening to these two was Senior Blues by Taj Mahal. This track opens with some nice cymbal work, and in listening to it on the Aries, the cymbals sound more lifelike and realistic than they did from the GT. That said, the Aries is also a more intimate presentation that kind of wraps around the head rather than projecting out in front of you. And that to me is a bit of a drawback with the Aries. I like a soundstage that pushes out more in front of me and around me with a greater sense of space, but it's something I'm willing to trade off with the Aries because everything else sounds so good. The openness and the spaciousness from the Soloist also results in it having a bit more transparency, but it comes at the cost of a sound that's not quite as liquid and organic sounding as the Aries. The Aries isn't a warm amplifier, and it may sound like I'm describing a warmer, richer sound, but it's really not. It's smooth and liquid and organic. It's got this effortless tonality to it that just kind of flows forth with the music. Whereas I feel like the Soloist GT is a little bit more high-strung with its sound. It's still incredibly enjoyable, and as I've said a couple of times already, these two amps are absolutely neck and neck in performance. But I guess it's kind of like, ironically, the Soloist GT comes across more like a full-on sports car that's a little bit finicky at times. If you're on a bumpy road, it's going to tell you you're on a bumpy road and you might be a little less comfortable. Whereas the Aries to me is more like a true Grand Tourer, which in the car world means it's designed for comfort, high performance, but long-term enjoyment. So a true GT in the automotive sense is a car that you can drive anywhere and everywhere and thoroughly enjoy the performance. Whereas a full-on thoroughbred sports car is more likely to be a bit picky about which road you put it on. It's going to let you know if things aren't so good, and it's going to make things a bit less comfortable. And that to me is what the Burson Soloist GT is. So both are excellent in their own way, but the Aries for me is the one that I can constantly enjoy and just immerse myself in music with, whereas the GT is occasionally a little bit less forgiving. Talking a bit more about the track Senior Blues by Taj Mahal, listening to things like the vocals and the trumpet, the GT was definitely giving me a better sense of texture and kind of tonal nuance from both of those instruments, the vocals and the trumpets again. But the Aries was just so effortless and easy, and tonality was still spot on. So what I'm talking about from the GT is just maybe that last 0.5 or 1% of detail retrieval that the Aries doesn't necessarily give. But it's not, I think, that the detail isn't there. I think it's more in terms of the very subtle nuances in the frequency response tuning. And when we start to talk about frequency response in amplifiers, it gets a bit tricky, because I guarantee if you measured both of these at a normal tolerance level, they'd both measure dead flat. But somewhere there's an ever so slight emphasis in the character of the treble from the Soloist GT that the Aries doesn't have. And what that means is that the Soloist GT emphasizes a little bit of the upper air and texture and clarity in things, whereas I feel like the Aries doesn't try to do any of those tricks. It just presents the music as it is. That gives you a little bit more richness and nuance in the deeper harmonics of the music at the expense of maybe not hearing all those fine details in the treble. And so neither is better or worse, they're just different. There's a piano solo in the middle of Senior Blues, and listening to that from the Soloist GT, there was a better sense of attack and clarity and energy from the piano, but then going over to the Aries, there was a better sense of richness and harmonics and the depth of the piano. The full range of its warmth and richness came through. Again, not that the Aries is a rich warm amp, it's just that it doesn't have that upper frequency emphasis that the Soloist does have just a tiny little bit of. The final thing I'd mention, specifically still talking about Senior Blues, is that I feel like the Soloist GT does a better job at producing layers in the sound. Its sense of soundstage space and layering and depth is definitely a strong point. The Aries doesn't do as well there. It's a more intimate presentation overall, but having said that, it's a presentation that never feels cramped. There's less overall space, but there's still excellent separation of every individual sound. And so it's going to come down to personal taste. These are very much two top shelf amps, and you can't go wrong with either. For me, if you had a headphone like say an HD800S or a regular HD800 or the various focal headphones, I'd probably lean towards the Aries because they already produce fairly good sound stages and they've also got a slightly brighter, more energetic treble. If though you had something richer and warmer like say a Mesa Empyrean, that's where I'd lean back towards something like the Soloist GT to give it that extra bit of attack and energy. And so hopefully you can see from this that this is really about what's going to suit your taste and your system. Another example I'll throw into the mix is if I'm listening to the Mesa Elites, either amplifier I would just flip a coin on because they're a very neutral, detailed but warm headphone. They suit both. Moving to the Hi-Fi and Susvara, I definitely like the Aries just a little bit more because the Soloist GT, with its bit of extra character, that extra little bit of emphasis I mentioned, that can take the slightly overly neutral and dry Susvara just a little bit too far sometimes. Whereas the Aries has that lovely sense of richness, that harmonic sense of richness to it that really takes the Susvaras to a whole nother level. And so hopefully that's helping to illustrate for you why one amp is not better than the other, they're just different. But let me give you one more super quick track example to put this further into context. One of the tracks that came on while I was still listening, putting my notes together, was Rosanna by Toto. This is famously a wonderful recording made by some of the top studio and session musicians in the world. Having said that, it's also sometimes a slightly overdone recording in my opinion. It's a little bit too clinical and a little bit too sterile, even though it's a track that I love. What that means when you play it through both the Soloist GT and the Aries is that the Soloist GT brings forward a little bit too much of that sterility and that clinical perfection from the recording by doing things like bringing the snares, the cymbals, and some of the vocal texture a little bit too forward. The Aries, on the other hand, helps to bring the focus and your attention onto the harmonic richness of the other instruments. Things like the kick drum have a bit more drive when you're listening to it from the Aries compared to from the Soloist GT. And it's not that the Soloist GT lacks oomph and presence from the bass, it's just that it's offset by that character in the upper mids and treble. The Aries, on the other hand, gives you that full sense of richness, and to me, it has the more pleasing tonality on a track like Rosanna. You are trading off a little bit of detail retrieval and a sense of clarity going to the Aries instead of the GT, and of course you're losing that sense of size in the soundstage. But on that track, the Aries for me is the preferable amplifier. And so let me bring all this to a final conclusion, which is to say that both of these amps that I'm talking about today are stellar headphone amps. If I'm looking for clinical precision and absolute detail retrieval from an amplifier, I probably will continue to reach for the Soloist GT, but the amplifier that's going to be my main regular day-to-day listening system other than the TT2 and M scaler is going to be the Sparkos Labs Aries. What I'm currently doing is moving the Soloist GT into my testing setup. That's the amplifier I'm going to use when I really want to hear the finest details, every little bit of nuance from a DAC or a set of headphones, or if I'm comparing other amplifiers to see what the absolute limits of sound are. None of this is to say that the GT isn't a fantastic and incredibly enjoyable amplifier. It's more to say that the Aries is just so much better to interact with for me. The GT, as I've already said, is a bit like a sports car and a high-tuned sports car, where it's a little bit finicky at times. The control system's not quite perfect. I feel like it doesn't give me quite enough volume range for the more sensitive gear that I'm trying. Little things like that just prevent me from loving every moment interacting with the GT. And keep in mind, I'm using these devices a little bit differently from most. I'm constantly chopping and changing, trying different stuff, using different setups, and so for me, the usability of a product is incredibly important because I'm making lots of changes regularly. And that's where for me, I absolutely adore the Aries. It falls short of the GT by not having that second XLR input, but it makes up for it for me by just being a joy to interact with. It also doesn't have the balanced output, and so I'm often having to adapt my XLR or 4.4mm finished plugs into the 6.3mm, which is a little bit of a hassle, but it really isn't the end of the world. The combination of that liquidity, that ease with which the music just flows out of the Aries, mixed in with the ease of use and the simplicity of interacting with this amp, make it an absolute no-brainer for me as the hub of my system. And so to give you a sense of my current final setup, which no doubt will change in a couple of months, but for now I'm running the M scaler into the TT2, out of the TT2 using a set of Curious Cable XLR interconnects which are feeding into the Sparkos Labs Aries, and then the Sparkos Labs Aries drives some of my headphones when I'm not plugging directly into the TT2, but then the Aries is also outputting into other amplifiers like the TU8200R behind me, which often drives my Susvaras, and then from time to time I also plug in my studio monitors and run them out of here. So as you can see, there's a huge amount of versatility coming from the Aries. It's a joy to use, and it's just such a magical, transparent, but liquid sounding amplifier that I can't help but recommend it. And that's why I wanted to come back and revisit this review. It's just that I felt like it deserved a really thorough revision, given that I've now got much higher gear and the ability to hear exactly what this is capable of. And that is top tier, incredibly effortless sound that's just enjoyable, both in terms of listening to and then also in terms of the interactions. And so I want to say a huge thanks once again to Anu, the local distributor here for Sparkos Labs. I want to say a huge thanks to Andrew for the first chance to listen to this amplifier and then for making it and continuing to share his magic with the world. And so if you're looking to pick up an Aries for yourself and see why I'm so in love with it, I'll put information down below where you can either click through and check out the Sparkos Labs website, or where you can get in touch with Anu and buy it if you're here in Australia. Do check out the description as well, because I will have a chat to Anu and see if there's any kind of discounts we can arrange. I haven't confirmed it at time of recording this review, and so there may or may not be opportunities there, but I'll see what's possible. I hope you found this review useful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and like. It really helps the channel to continue growing and sharing content like this with you. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.